Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the second episode of Order of the Rod and Rings YouTube channel. Today, I am joined by my special guest, Johann Faust. And today, we will be talking about a number of topics from Western esotericism to Middle Eastern divination and everything in between. I think we could probably coin this episode Model Minorities Behaving Badly. Or, well, maybe the title will come to us later during the course of this interview. So take it away, Johann. Tell us all about yourself. Everyone wants to hear an origin story. And what better place to start than, than explaining who you are, what you're all about? Were you drawn from a basket in the river? Were you left on someone's doorstep? Did you come to us from another planet?
Hi, Sam. Thank you for having me on. I'm really glad to be over here. So I'll give you my introduction in brief. It's kind of the cliff notes. Biracial child raised in an interfaith marriage, develops a crisis of faith himself, moves to America, discovers ceremonial magic, and the rest is history. Insofar as origin stories go, I guess those would be the major highlights of where I came from, how I found myself, and what I tend to do, and what my praxis is.
So it's fascinating that we both have a similar, I don't want to say same, but we do have a similar background. You are from the Middle East. I'm from Central Asia. You are the quote unquote product of a biracial marriage, as am I. My father was a Christian missionary. My mother is an indigenous Pakistani woman. And not long after I was born, grew up, we then moved to the States. So I know it's been a wild ride for me as what we would call a third culture kid. Why don't you elaborate on how wild of a ride it's been for you? Are you also finding yourself as someone inhabiting this liminal space from Western culture to Eastern identity? Is it something that often keeps you awake at night, like it does me and other people like us?
No, absolutely. As I stated earlier in my intro, I am the product of a biracial marriage. My father was English, and being basically inhabiting these two worlds, the world of the East and the world of the West, it's very often that children like us don't really fit in anywhere else. There is something that marks us as an other, where I could never be white enough to fit in with all the other British kids, nor could I ever be Asian or Arab enough to fit in with any of those kids in school. So very often people like you and me are left to carve out our own identities by virtue of the fact that we don't really fit in anywhere else. And within that space that we tend to carve out for ourselves, I believe is where magic can truly exist. Is we create an identity where there is none for us to inhabit. There is no roadmap, or there is no path laid out for us, or there is no demographic like us that is, very prominent where we can look at them and assimilate into. We've often got to carve out an ethnic identity and a space for who we are.
Yeah, most definitely. I like to think of us not so much as third culture kids, even though that's apparently the accepted term for those in the know. I like to mystify that term. We're the children of the liminal. That's trademarked. No one else can use that.
I like that.
But I do think that as minorities within a minority, there's a certain insight that we have that might potentially be lost on others, specifically here in the West, where the dominant culture, if you will, is based on, at least here in the States, it is based on what could be classified as white Christian values. I know that that's a divisive set of words to use, but that is the reality. We are minorities in a predominantly white Christian culture, even if it's nominally white and Christian, especially as we have other minorities like us, other minorities who are not like us, that are rising in prominence. They are expressing themselves, their voice is being heard. And where I'm going with this is, here in the West, we've got this breaking point where culture is being redefined. We have ethnicity that's being redefined. People are coming into their own in terms of connecting with their roots, connecting with their ancestry. We have ancestry.com not sponsoring this, 23andMe, who's also not sponsoring this. And we have so many people that are looking to these things, much in the same way that once upon a time we would look to like our birth charts as some way to define us, to define our identity, to define the path that we're on in life, to even define our future. Having said that, with all of these various resources and avenues that we have at our disposal, or that we could pursue and explore, it really does open the world up to us in a proverbial sense, that we can draw from these various spiritual currents that are in our background. How do you feel about that?
No,
do you think that we have that advantage?
Absolutely. You raise a very cogent point. Not really having that identity pre-made for us, it is something we exert our own agency and go out into life and create for ourselves. And to that end, thank you for having a kind of space that exists for people like you and me, where we can have these conversations. These kind of spaces have to be, I believe, created by people like you and me, for people like you and me, as there's not a lot of other places that we can have interchanges like this. So to that end, not having really that pre-made identity, I really do think that allows us to go out and explore. It allows us to go out and seek what resonates with us. It allows us to go out and curate who we are meant to be, the things that resonate with us, the things that we can adopt, the things that make us who we are, rather than following a standard script. There is no doubt in my mind that I was meant to be the person that I presently am. And in maybe in some of the same ways that followed your own path, where you probably thought, there isn't a standard script for me to fall into. There is something out there for me, and this ain't it. I've got to go out and find that.
Truer words were never spoken. As someone who is also from a similar background, do you have, or do you find yourself caught up in some sort of tango, if you will? I'm going to presume that your Middle Eastern background is largely shaped by Islam. Would that be correct?
Yes, absolutely. My mother was Muslim. As I stated earlier, I grew up in the Middle East. Islam was the dominant religion out where I lived. It's something that most people that are raised as Muslims don't really have a chance to think about, because you're born into it. You're surrounded by it. I guess when I discovered that there was something that I wasn't being true to, that would be it. And it's not an issue of the religion itself. It is more religion. It's more a matter of my own crisis of faith, where I felt that there was something more out there, and that the things that I was doing, I wasn't being true to what I felt I needed to be doing. And that is what sort of sent me out on my journey to go out and discover and travel and read books and adopt other systems. Not having that pre-laid script or that ethnic identity, so to speak, is very interesting, because I think people like you and me, we inhabit two worlds. When we're around people with a similar ethnic background, we can easily switch into that mode. We understand the values, the cultural mindset, the things that you're supposed to say or not say, even the food. the customs, like it can be even simple things like taking off your shoes at the door, not walking into the house with your shoes on. Things of that sort, where we're around people of a more Western background, we can easily slip into that mode as well and understand that modality of thought. Having that foot in either world but belonging to neither, it's both a boon and a curse, because we can see the advantages of either of those modalities of thought, as well as looking at them through a critical eye and noticing the inherent contradictions in both modes of faith, in both cultures.
In many ways, that also makes us, I don't want to say enemies, but I do feel that it does put us in a position where we do end up focusing on a lot of the faults, especially as they would pertain to many societal things that we take for granted here in the West. You know, we have all of these freedoms, we have, you know, agency. We don't live under the threat, the true threat of religious tyranny. You know, we have people, especially in the neo-pagan community, that have this mindset that any day now, all of the practicing witches in the United States are going to be rounded up and burned at the stake or hung on the gallows like the witches of yore in Salem. We can turn on the news at any moment, especially right now with the horrifying civil unrest in countries like Iran, where people's lives literally are at stake. People are being gunned down in the streets for speaking out against the dominant religion, for speaking out against those who are in power. And where I'm going with that is we have these advantages here as citizens in the West, where we don't live in fear of reprisal. I know myself, if I were to never have left Pakistan and grew up there and, you know, lived into adulthood and embraced or even dared to mention exploring Near Eastern polytheism, pre-Islamic, pre-Christian religious traditions, animism, I would be completely blacklisted. I'm fairly certain that I would also be swinging on the end of a rope, especially in a predominantly Muslim country, or actually not even predominantly. Pakistan is a Muslim country. Anything remotely tied to idolatry, blasphemy, is a death sentence. Full stop. There is nothing that, short of that, that one could be sentenced with.
Those are real threats. For example, members of the Christian community in Pakistan are regularly subject to attacks. Religious minorities like the Shia community are regularly subjected to attacks. Certain parts of the Middle East, it is not hyperbole to say that practicing some form of occultism can earn you a death sentence. That is not an idle threat. That could basically be your fate. It could be mob justice. And where I think a lot of people in the pagan community, where they say these things and they kind of get bombastic about what may happen or what they believe may happen, is they don't have the experience of living abroad. So they can't really make that comparison with the freedoms that we enjoy here in the West. You're free to say whatever it is you want within reason. You obviously are held to account for whatever your words are, provided that they're not harmful to someone else. But you do have that freedom to voice out your point of view in a respectful manner. You do have the freedom to practice whatever beliefs that you do want to practice, or even to explore your own intellectual curiosity, or even to leave a religion for that matter. where abroad you just don't have that freedom. That just does not exist. And a lot of people that harbor on, and I'm familiar with the train of thought that you had described, but the only thing is with those people that talk about those things in a flippant manner and have these persecution or these ideas of imminent persecution, they've never lived abroad. They do, I mean, respectfully, they do not know what they are talking about. They have lived over here in relative security and freedom and take that for granted and just flippantly say that, something is going to happen any day now without having looked at, things abroad or very viscerally, seen things happen abroad and know that, those things cannot happen over here because we do have freedom and that's guaranteed. The Constitution and so on and so forth. Not to get political, but you get my
we're already getting political by discussing religion and persecution in the United States. So we're just 2 steps away from courting controversy altogether and being canceled. So what better place to do it than here online, where our words will live forever in perpetuity. Yeah, that's a good point though, because there is so much that we do take for granted. I do remember growing up hearing accounts of my maternal grandfather who, after he had converted to Christianity, his father and his brothers who were Muslim, they actually attempted to perform an honor killing because he did commit apostasy by converting from Islam to Christianity. It's horrifying to think, here in the States, we have writers talking about this persecution when I can directly say that were it not for the fact that my grandfather was able to escape and flee for his life into safety, I would not be here. And I don't think that a majority of these people could say the same thing.
No, exactly. A charge of blasphemy against Islam in Pakistan can earn you a death sentence. Again, that is not hyperbole. That is a fact.
And not so much you, it also taints your family members, anyone that you were associated with, your friends, your family, your coworkers. They can all come under suspicion too, because they do know you, because they have spent time with you in your sphere of influence, if you will. They're all just as guilty as you are.
Exactly. And that is something that you're not living in abject terror of happening when you live out over here. So, I mean, again, respectfully, I think a lot of the people that harbor those fears of persecution, I respectfully disagree with them, is probably the best way to put it, that they have not seen persecution up front and close, where it has been an imminent threat to them or those around them to really speak on that issue in an authoritative manner, where if you live abroad or if you've traveled extensively, you are well aware of those threats. You know that they exist, and you're very cautious about what you say, what opinions you tend to proffer, who you say what around.
Mm-hmm.
Something else you're very conscious about. And in very many cases where things come up in conversation, you just refrain from having an opinion, period. And that is real. That is something people need to acknowledge.
Yeah, I remember going back several years ago with my mother and my siblings, and we were told just not to speak in public, because the minute they found out that we were Americans at that point, we would also be singled out, much less for being Christian. That's another thing that would have singled us out. In fact, around that same time that we were traveling throughout Pakistan to visit various family members, there were actually Christians that were being rounded up and executed mob style. So just the mere thought of it now, years later, decades later, it's just unsettling. It's just terrifying knowing that there are people who live in fear to this day. We've certainly taken a dark turn. So let's talk about other things right now that aren't so dark and gloomy. So having said all of those things, there is that importance of cultivating a image that is protected and keeping silent, if you will, to take away from one of Crowley's many prized maxims.
And keeping silent on magic is something I really do believe in. I'm a firm believer in the maxim to know, to dare, to keep silent. I would rather show people my results than talk about, my plans. That's Albert Einstein for you. But that is something I firmly believe in. I think that faith and not doubting what the result of things will be is crucial. And why would anyone want to go off and tell somebody what they're about to do when those people might not share your faith or your belief in the efficacy of what you're about to do?
Oh, yeah, most definitely. In fact, I think we spend more time telling people what we're going to do versus actually doing those very things. And having said that, what do you consider to be of importance within the context of an esoteric praxis, aside from knowing, willing, daring, and remaining silent?
No, absolutely. There are a couple of things that I believe make a person a really good magician. I believe that we've come out of a period of mass trauma, that we've come out of COVID. I mean, in some places it's still ongoing. We've had upwards of 1 million people die, and people have lost their businesses and their health. I really do think that a certain amount of self-care makes for a really good magician. And in that sense, it's important to curate a structure and a routine and to know the difference between magic and magical thinking. And I'll get into that in a minute. To that end, the things that I think that really make a good magician is having the fortitude, like good mental health. If you have issues, talk to someone. If you have, let's say, a physical praxis of some sort, that is something that I think people should root themselves in. So I'll go over 3 key maxims that I think make a really good magician. I believe that you can fortify your body by rooting yourself within a physical practice of some sort. When I was a lot younger, I took up boxing, and that was it for me. Being a little bit older right now, I do practice yoga, and I have been practicing Ashtanga for about 8 to 9 years now. I believe that you can fortify your soul with belief, and you can use divination to that end. Belief in the efficacy of what you're about to do is crucial. If you self-doubt the efficacy of what you're about to do, then all of your work is moot. And I'm not the only one to say that. It comes up in a number of esoteric books, the Picatrix, it comes up in the Grimoire of Arthur Gauntlet. That is a key facet to fortify yourself against doubt, fortify your soul. If you take divination to overcome that, to know that the path that you're on is right for you, use it. And then lastly, fortify your mind with good mental health. You can root yourself in some kind of praxis, whether it's ritual work, whether it's a devotion to a saint, to a god, to regular routine of ritual work, things of that sort. I believe fortifying your mind, body, and soul in this manner actually makes a person not just a good magician, but it also makes you a good person to be around. When you're less stressed because you have a routine in these 3 habits of your life, or these 3 parts of your life, it makes you a better partner to somebody else. It makes you, I think, a better person to be around.
So you'd mentioned the Picatrix, and you've piqued my interest because you're not the only one to mention that text within the context of your own personal praxis. Would you feel comfortable elaborating on your incorporation of the Picatrix into your own personal praxis?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, The very first chapter and the very first paragraph of the Picatrix is something that spoke to me. It was something that resonated with me, and it's something that I think a lot of people that are in the esoteric community, whether they're neophytes or just coming into this, or they don't have a lot of results to show, it's something that I don't think a lot of people think about. So this is the some of the opening lines from the Picatrix, Book 1, Chapter 1. How you may know your place in the universe. How you may know your degree in the universe. You should know, my dearest brother, that the best and most noble gift that God has given to humanity in this world is knowledge. By knowledge, we become acquainted with ancient things and the causes of everything in the world. And what more immediate causes are the causes of other things, and how one thing corresponds to another. By this we can know everything that is, why it is, and why one thing is raised above another in due order, and in what place exists the root and beginning of all the things of this world, that thing by which all things are dissolved, and through which everything new and old is made known. For this is truly the first, and it lacks nothing, nor does it need anything else with it except itself. It is the cause of all other things, and does not receive its qualities from another. That is something that really resonated with me. How may you know your degree in the world? And when I started along this path, that is the thing that I opened up my practice with. How may I know my degree in this world? Another aspect that I believe makes for a very good magician is the faculty of having an imagination. Every good magician has to have a certain amount of mental headspace required to have a healthy imagination. To that end, I really do believe if you think about things, every form of magic, it exists in certain stages. Magic begins with an idea. It's codified by symbols. It's actuated by rituals. This is not something I came up with. This is Eliphas Levi 101. I'm just paraphrasing him. But when it begins in the mind, you do have to have the imagination and the mental bandwidth required to have that undertaking. And that's where I really believe a good magician, having good mental health, having the bandwidth to free up your imagination, really does make you a better magician.
It's an interesting observation. What do you perceive to be the pitfalls that the esoteric community as a whole would face in light of what's highlighted in the passage that you've read, as well as your personal philosophy?
Yeah, that's a really good place to start. When I started down this path, that was the first thing that I asked myself. How may I know what my degree is in the universe, in this hierarchy of being? Where am I? And how may I advance myself? And one of the pitfalls that I think a lot of esotericists, one of the pitfalls that I think that they find out the hard way is you have a lot of people that tend to dabble, and you have people that pick up a book, try spell out of a book without understanding the, let's say, the philosophical underpinnings of magic. What do I mean by that is, having a background in game theory, I tend to think of magic in terms of pushing probabilities. And that is the difference between magic and magical thinking. Magic operates, in my experience, and I'm not speaking for anyone else, just in my own personal praxis, it operates to the extent that it pushes the odds of probability in your favor. It doesn't mean that you lay back and you don't do anything else. It's all of the above. It's the efforts that you put into the world, because mostly the things that you have a direct influence on, or the things that you've reached out and touched, or the endeavors that you have put into play, those are the things that you tend to have the greatest effect on. Where a lot of people trip themselves up is they buy a book, they skip the philosophical underpinnings, they read a spell, they try a ritual, without understanding that your mind has to actually believe in this. Your mind has to be convinced that this is going to work in order for it to be effective. If you're waiting to try something to see if it's effective first before you develop that faith, I don't think you will ever have an effective practice. And if someone out there has done that and it has worked for them, I'm, by no means picking an argument with them. I can only talk about my own experiences and how I arrived over here with not a lot of resources and basically built myself up to the person that I am today.
The equivalent of pulling yourself up by your magical bootstraps, if you will. So you had mentioned something about buying books and reading a spell, if you will. And to those that are listening, that doesn't mean that I'm going to denigrate the fact that people do write and have books published. I myself am a published writer, so I would be shooting myself in the foot by making that statement. One thing that I do want to discuss, we've had conversations about this in the past, as it pertains to the accessibility, more so the commercialization of the esoteric. We have individuals who would have never in a million years incorporated an esoteric, even a cult practice, into their daily life. And now it's becoming so incredibly mainstream. We have everyone from talk show hosts to stay-at-home moms to business moguls, all repeating many of the same maxims that would have otherwise been ignored by the mainstream in decades past. What are your thoughts on that? I'm going to pick your brain here for as long as you'll let me.
No, that's a reasonable question. I really do think that people are looking for answers, and we've come out of COVID. We've had this massive trauma where countless people, have been injured by COVID, or they've seen degradations to their livelihoods, their businesses. I think people are looking for answers, and the commercialization of the occult is something that I do think about a lot. On the one hand, if you're a practitioner and you're creating a book or you're creating a deck in all earnestness, and it is something that you tend to use a lot or something of that sort where it does figure into your personal practice and how you approach things, I think that is, that's amazing that you can share that with other people. And where they take something that is sacred or they take an esoteric part of a tradition and then they dumb it down and they commercialize it, that is the thing I think I personally would take umbrage with. It doesn't seem like these people are sincere. It seems like they're cashing in.
Yeah, it's the reverse of taking a sow's ear and turning it into a silk purse. It's taking a silk purse and turning it into a sow's ear.
Exactly. And I've heard people argue it the other way around, and they were like, well, what if, you're somebody who didn't really think about tarot and you get like a tarot cap deck, and what about that? And, I guess you could argue it either way, but for me personally, it does seem like it's sort of commercializing something that was esoteric and something that has a lot of significance, and you're just mainstreaming it, and you're not approaching it with the reverence or the respect or the honor for its tradition and its heritage, which it warrants, by creating some of these projects or what have you.
Speaking of projects, I understand you've got a project of your own that's up your sleeve, something that is completely informed by your background. Would you like to share that with our listeners?
Yeah, absolutely, Sam. So I practice geomancy, and for people that haven't heard of geomancy, it is a form of divination that originated in the Middle East, where it was called Khat al-Ramal, or sand cutting, or Ilm al-Ramal, the science of sand. And it migrated gradually west by the contact between East and West via merchants, traders, things of that sort, and gradually became the most popular form of divination in the West. Although now it's largely died out and relatively unknown, it was once second only to astrology as a form of divination. And that's a form of divination that I practice my own self. I believe it has an incredible amount of efficacy. As geomancy, you can phrase a question in binary terms, and it's sort of front loaded in that you get the answer first, and then you look at a geomantic chart and work your way back. And I believe that this is a system that a lot of people, if they discovered it and they cast their first chart, I believe that they would also discover the efficacy of geomancy and, likely take it up as a practice in the same way that I did.
Is this something that's actually practiced today in the Middle East?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, 100%. So when I was growing up in the Middle East, in certain rural parts of Oman, this is a praxis that you can find people practicing. Literally, occasionally you find people throwing basically it's a form of brass dice called kira. And although in Oman they have a different formula for the dice, but you would sometimes find people doing geomancy by dropping the dice down. Other instances, you literally would have a guy with a stick and some stand and making sand and basically counting them up and doing geomancy. It's a very accessible form of divination in the Middle East. There are not a lot of people that do it, but in some of the more rural parts of Oman, it is very acceptable for people to practice geomancy. You can consider it like a form of sahar or like theurgy, like more like, or rather, ruhaniya, sorry, I misspoke, more like ruhaniya, like white magic or theurgy, and basically not like really magic or something like that. So that is something that is still practiced. The project that I have is basically I've created an authentic set of brass kira dice as well as a brass calling plate. So I'll get into a little bit about geomancy and how this practice works. Originally, geomancers in the desert in the Middle East, where this practice comes from, they would enter into like a trance-like state. First, they would open up with some prayers. They would focus intently on the question that's being asked of them. They would take a stick, go into this trance-like state while focusing on the question, and then poking random divots into the sand. They would do this 4 separate times. They would count the figures up as odd or even numbers, and then they would comprise the first 4 figures that go into a geomantic chart, or what we call a shield, or you could use an astrological chart. It's very similar in structure to the I Ching, where the I Ching is made up of 6-line figures, a hexagram. In geomancy, we have 4-line figures. So geomancy is a system that uses the language of astrology. It uses the 12 astrological houses. It uses the 7 classical planets. And it uses the astrological signs to give the diviner the ability to read a chart and to pull out information from a chart to inform the querent of what the answer is. When I first set out to learn another system of divination aside from tarot, I wanted a system of divination that would work well with my own practice of ceremonial magic. To that end, geomancy fit the bill perfectly. It's a praxis with a lot of overlap, where if you're doing ceremonial magic or you practice Geoisha. So for example, with geomancy, you can use it to find out whether a ritual is right or not, since it uses binary. terms to decipher what your answer is. You can ask questions like that and divine an answer of whether you should go ahead with the ritual or not. I will not perform any type of ritual practice or any kind of remediation, magical or otherwise, without consulting a geomantic chart. Furthermore, geomancy, you can also do ritual baths before taking a chart and doing the divination. You perform some prayers also. Geomancers have a wide variety of prayers that they use. Here in the West, people use more like Enochian prayers. There's a very good book that just came out with Dr. Al Cummings, where he talks about his own practice, and he created a book of Enochian prayers, which is really an amazing cross-pollination of magical praxis, taking one thing from one place and applying it to another, which is absolutely amazing, a true innovation. More Eastern geomancers, they use certain Quranic phrases and passages and surahs. So there is that. And then for my own personal practice, when I'm reading for other people, I imported just staying away from animal products also as a fast prior to doing my divination. So I do a 3-day fast prior to a weekend where I'm going to be reading for people. And I do believe that the combination of the diet restrictions, ritual cleansing of myself, and then going into prayers prior to the divination really does cohere better answers for the people that I'm reading for.
That is incredibly fascinating. And
Yeah.
what I find is even more fascinating is that it is still practiced today, and especially in the Middle East, where anything remotely magical is highly denigrated, and it's just it really does speak to the cultural understanding and acceptance when it comes to certain practices, especially in the context of theurgy, where you're more or less bending God's ear.
Oh, absolutely. The thing about geomancy, Sam, is when you lay out a card spread. So, like, let's say you're doing tarot and you lay out a card spread. You're forming a narrative based on the relationship of the cards one to another to inform what your answer is to the question being asked. When the difference between geomancy and tarot is when you're doing a geomantic reading, you're actually performing an act of esoteric cartography. You're mapping out a series of interactions that occur, interactions with planetary, elemental, astrological correspondences that is highly accurate, and you're mapping that down on a chart. The difference again between tarot and geomancy is this: with tarot readers, they will give you an answer to your question, and very often it's like, okay, well, good luck. You pull the tower, you have like a really bad answer, and sorry, nothing I can do. Given the modalities of geomancy and its astrological correspondences, when you have a geomantic shield in front of you, you're mapping out the series of interactions. You can see what part of the interaction is proving to be problematic, and that lends itself really well to astrological magic as a remediation. It lends itself really well to talismanic magic, using some of the geomantic figures themselves, because they do have that planetary and astrological and elemental virtue. You can use these things as remediations to alter the chart. Sometimes, depending on the way the chart is, you can absolutely tell somebody that you're reading for that, look, this cause, there is absolutely nothing I can do. Other times, when you can see that there's only a certain choke point, or that this thing will just need to be tipped over a little bit further, there are things that you can suggest to that individual that you're reading for. If you would like, here are some things that you can do. Here are some stones that you can use. Here are some candles you can burn. Here are some planetary prayers I can recommend. Or you yourself, if they hire you to do that undertaking for them, you can use your own knowledge of astrological magic to tip things in that person's favor. as a general practice to my own readings for other people, I follow up with everybody that I read for 2 months after the reading and get their feedback to find out, did the thing I tell you about, did it come to pass or not? Because I believe that as a reader, that's part of my integrity. I would like to know that if there's something that I got wrong, I need to know what that is, because that is important to keep myself honest, to keep myself accurate, that I can pinpoint where exactly, the chart was, what exactly I said, and whether it came to pass or not. I document all of my readings, I follow up with people, and I haven't heard anything negative to the extent that, okay, what you had, told me in the reading did not happen. The only time that I've gotten things not exactly right was when I first started to do geomancy, and I was afraid of telling people some of the things that a chart was actually saying, couching the bad news in some of my own terms, some of my own terminology. I was coming from a tarot perspective, and tarot leaves a lot of room for interpretation. And I was bringing some of that energy with me to geomancy, where the answer of geomancy, think of geomancy as a 15-card spread. You have the first 4 figures that you can roll your dice, the Kira dice that I create, or you can use odds or evens like coins. Anything that will give you a binary response is something that you can use to create the first set of 4-line figures called the mothers. Those 4-line figures called the mothers are added up to produce the next set of 4-line figures called the daughters. Other figures are added to produce the nieces, and from there you get the left witness, the right witness, and you get a judge. So altogether, you can think of that as a 15-card spread. The judge is literally your answer to what your question is. And then when I was getting things not maybe the most accurate was when I was bringing a tarot reader's perspective and giving myself room for interpretation and forming a narrative. That is not geomancy. Geomancy will give you a most accurate answer that leaves very little room for interpretation. And that is what I like about it. It keeps you on point as a reader. There's very little room. You can understand nuances of a chart. You can explain that, the modalities of how things will happen. But in whether something is a good idea or a bad idea, whether it will happen or not happen, or sometimes that there is no answer. There, it's up in the air right now. Check back in a month or so. But geomancy will give you a definitive answer in that context. And that is what I really appreciated about it as a system of divination.
So there's definitely no nuance whatsoever. It really sounds like you have to take all of your preconceived notions that come with Western iterations of divination and throw them out the window, because it's completely reliant on something that at least I would perceive to be anathema to Western modes of divination. Would that be safe to say?
Not in its entirety. For example, when you're looking at a shield, you can see certain patterns of energy interplay with one another. And as a reader, if you're looking at a judge, it's going to give you a definitive answer. The rest of the chart, you can read that, and that part is open to some interpretive skills. It's a system with a lot of nuance. Where geomancy fell out of popularity was where people condensed the nuances of geomancy into lookup charts that said either good, bad, not so good, not so bad, maybe. And that's a lot of old geomantic texts. I can name one, for example, like Franz Hartmann's Astrological Geomancy has a number of these lookup tables, and those lookup tables are what took the nuances out of geomancy and sort of simplified it down to a form of lookup tables. The Golden Dawn was also guilty of that. To that end, it does have interpretive elements, and the more you interact with geomancy, the more you meditate on the figures and learn their meanings, learn their correspondences, learn in what houses they're strong, what houses they're weak, you're able to explain to the reader how these patterns of energy will manifest themselves in the thing that they're asking about, in the interactions, in the situation, how this will manifest itself. So it does require, I hope I didn't like make that mistake by simplifying it too much. It does require an interpretive element, but not in a narrative sense that tarot does. Geomancy will give you the answer up front. This will happen. If you're going to proceed down this path, it's a bad idea. Or, and here's exactly, the things that you can expect. Furthermore, geomancy has a thing that some people call non-consecutive addition. For example, if you want to know how your significant other is going to get along with your father, because geomancy uses the astrological houses, you can actually add the figures up and to see what figure you get. So you would add the figure that pops up in house 7 for your significant other and look at the figure in house 4, which represents your father. Add those two figures together, and what figure you get is a reasonable interpretation of how your significant other and your father will interact. That is something that you're not going to really have with tarot card reading. There is no way to add the sun and the 8 of wands and the tower or something like that. You have to fit those things into a narrative to answer a question. With geomancy, you have this non-consecutive addition, which does, again, give you very highly accurate answers if you know how to interpret the houses, the elements, to explain to the querent. These are how these patterns of interaction will manifest themselves. These are the potentialities that you could be looking at. For another example, if you're thinking about taking a job and you want to know how this position will interact with my finances, you can add the figure that will appear in house 10 to house 2. House 2 governing your personal finances, your wealth, house 10 governing your career. You add these two figures together. It's a reasonably good idea of how taking for example, a job will tend to manifest itself with your personal finances. That is one of the key elements that I feel is crucial for geomancy, why this is the divination system that is the divination system for right now. It deals directly with your material well-being, the things that affect you directly. The things that you really can't get much of an answer for with geomancy that I value tarot for is the narrative elements. As my friend Brian Wilkins said, that he would use geomancy for strategy, but you would consult tarot for tactics. So I'm not trying to pick a fight with tarot card readers and, like trying to say my divination system beats up your divination system. Totally not.
I understand. I read tarot, so it's no big deal.
There's a place, it's a big tent. There's a place for all of these things. There's ways that you can use both of these things to complement one another. For example, if someone had to ask you, how can I get along better with my spouse? Geomancy would probably say, get another spouse. It's over. Like,
sign the divorce papers now. Move
right.
on.
Right.
That's not exactly practical.
Right. It's not going to deal with those nuances, and tarot will offer you suggestions on that. Conversely, if it was a divorce situation and you were going to wonder, how is this going to play out for me financially if I'm being taken to court? Geomancy will give you a really good answer on something like that. The more definitive your question, the more definitive an answer you will get out of geomancy.
Fascinating.
And in this day of age, where so many things are financially challenging for a lot of people, I really cannot praise the efficacy of geomancy, and not just because I'm a practitioner. There are many other people who practice geomancy, and they can attest to its results, so on and so forth. But when it comes down to dealing with your own material well-being and things that affect you, this is, or should be at any rate, your go-to for discerning what to do next. If you're a ceremonial magician and you want to know, is this ritual right for me? What kind of result will I yield out of this ritual work that I'm about to engage in, Geomancy is a system for you. If you enjoy aspects of ceremonial magic, the ritual baths, the diet, the prayers, things of that nature, those are direct practices that you can import from your ceremonial practice and bring to Geomancy with you. And I can look over basically books that I have of readings that I've done, and I can look back over the things that I've got where it was 10 out of 10. You know, you hit it out of the ballpark. You said exactly the thing that was going to happen. And I can look back at things that I was a bit hesitant to really tell somebody some news because I was still relying on some of the narrative elements of tarot. And I can see as gradually got out of the tarot reading mindset and got more into geomancy, I can actually chart the efficacy of the readings as they keep on going. So I've dated all of these things, I have them down in books, and I can actually chart my own progression. It keeps me honest.
So here we are recording on Saturday, the day of Saturn, and the thought just came to me. So we have this Saturnian current that is largely felt here in the West, that's woven through at least American society, that from my perception anyway, has control over the dreaded word capitalism, has control over the industrial prison complex. It has control over the judicial system and all of its underpinnings. Where I'm going with that is, what are your thoughts on capitalism as magic? Is that something that you think about? I know I think about it, especially in terms when it comes to things like algorithms, how they are treated almost like servitors.
No, I have a lot to say about that. That is something that you and I have discussed, and it's something that I've thought about a lot. I don't think magic died with the Enlightenment. I really don't, and I know there might be folks that disagree with me, but I believe magic is a science, and it was a science like astrology. A lot of people tend to connote magic these days with perhaps being something for people on the marginal fringes of society. But if you look at history, throughout history, magic has always been something that's been associated with the most learned men of society. It's been a tool for people that are winning, not people just on the fringes of society, or at least learned magic. That's, not to say that the witch hunts and so on and so forth, but it was largely persecuting women. And, there were no, at least in my knowledge, there weren't a lot of men that were burnt at the stake. So I'm not bellying that fact. To that end, I think that the Enlightenment evolved magic into different categories. Magic being something that you can operate to take agency in your own life, to increase the odds of probability of things that you want to happen to you. It can increase those odds, but there is no room for that in a society that operates on base materialism. Really effective magic doesn't happen today. It happens in the imagination and how you can shape tomorrow. Where capitalism and magic, in my opinion, they intersect is capitalism can take things that are quantifiable, things that can be mathematically gauged, measured, quantified, the amount of things you can do in an hour, the amount of cases you can produce, the amount of boxes you can lift, so on and so forth, quantifiable data. And magic doesn't operate in that manner. If you look at capitalism, for example, I don't know what else you will call a system that can traverse around the globe, suck up resources from every community, every country, take those resources and transmute it into ones and zeros. Again, that circle the globe on fiber optic cables, seeking a higher return. I mean, if you have a system that can transmute resources into ones and zeros, into, it can be anything. It can be sand, it could be cement, it could be cowrie shells, take anything. Capitalism will find a market for it. It will suck that up and it will transmute it via alchemy, almost like a form of sorcerous alchemy, into the ones and zeros, the dollars, the money. And I think that is one of the things that, in my opinion, is makes a lot of people doubt the efficacy of magic, is the fact that capitalism has convinced people unless it can be quantified, it is not real. Unless it can be measured algorithmically, it can be used to sell something, it can be used to gain a profit on an industrial scale. Unless it can do that, it has no value whatsoever. So, I mean, that's kind of my own take on how capitalism operates as a system of magic. I believe that magic works in an operative way on things that you have direct contact with. And capitalism is more something that affects society on a mass industrial scale. Magic always operates on an individual level, it doesn't operate on a mass level. And that is one of the things that I feel has gotten people convinced that there is no efficacy in magic. But then just look at capitalism, or just look at the thing that people believe killed magic, which is the Enlightenment. And along with it comes capitalism. What else would you call a system that can circle the globe, sucking in resources from everywhere and transmuting it into profit? A good magician, a really good magician, has to be about as materialistic as anything else. You have to be able to have a praxis, have the books, learn credibly, know everything that you're doing, put it into effect, and then gauge it by its material result on your own life. To know that, okay, that this is efficacious. If the magic that I was doing was not efficacious, I would have gone off and studied accounting. That would have been far easier than trying to learn astrology, making and buying tools, and all of those things.
Well, you've certainly given our listeners a lot to think about. I know you've certainly given me a lot to think about, and I have so many other questions that I could ask, so many other observations that I could make, but I'm fairly certain that that will have to wait for another time, and perhaps another appearance by yourself. I know I definitely want to highlight your geomantic practice when your set is available. I understand that your Kickstarter will be coming out soon. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And if I could just talk a little bit about that.
Definitely, please do.
Thank you. One of the things about the Kira set that I created is that these sets are no longer available. These are sets that I've seen only in museum collections. And if you're a geomancer and you're doing geomancy for people, or even if you're doing it for yourself, having Kira dice is a tool that you can use to connect to the history of geomancy. It was a tool like Kira, these spindles, these made out of 100% brass with these 4 sets of dice. You have 2 of them. You roll them around in your palms and drop them down on an astrological plate that you can use to read the first set of 4-line figures. Those tools are not being created by anyone right now. I don't believe in the commercialization of the occult. I take the things that I do very seriously. I believe in their efficacy. I believe in their tradition. And that is why I created this set of tools. Furthermore, I don't even mass manufacture these. When I set out to create this project for people, the only way I would move ahead with creating these Kira dice sets, as well as the brass geomantic calling plate. The calling plate is an item that geomancers can use in a reading. John Michael Greer goes over methods of spirit invocation, as each of the 7 planets have their own spirits that serve them. I have a brass calling plate with astrological symbolism etched onto its surface. It's got the spirit sigils. You can utilize those spirits in an invocation to call them into the reading. I personally favor a spirit-led approach to geomancy. I can even tell you that during a spirit invocation, it's the equivalent of having something sit on your shoulder and whisper, look at this place on the chart. There's an interaction over there. That's interesting. Look over here. That's something that may happen. What do you think about this? It's a very interesting facet of geomancy that I have thrown myself into. The only way I would move ahead with this project is if these tools could be made by hand, not etched by machine, but etched by hand, and that they were made in limited amounts for people. Because I don't want to commercialize this. This is a set that's made in limited amounts. It's all handmade, and using tools like this does connect back to the history of geomancy, which I believe is very important in adopting any kind of esoteric practice. That if you do approach it, not to say that you can't do it without these tools, obviously you can do it with any number of tools, but I do believe for my own self to stay true to a tradition by adopting a method and connecting to its heritage, to the tools used in the past, in the same way that I would do the same thing with ceremonial magic. Thank you.
And thank you. And I want to thank all of the listeners who tuned in today. And Johann, it's been a pleasure, as always, talking with you. And I certainly hope that you will join me again for another rousing episode of Model Minorities Behaving Badly. I think that might be the title that we do stick with. Or we could perhaps go with Third Culture Identity and Esoteric Practice in the American West. How does that sound?
Thank you for having me on, Sam, and thank you for creating the space where people like you and me with our own unique ethnic identities can have these conversations, because we're out here.